Get access to hundreds more exclusive history documentaries by downloading the History Hit app.
The world is changed forever by a new technology, nuclear. Two superpowers dominate the world, each facing the other in a state of neither war nor peace. This is the story of the Cold War, how the push of one button could lead to total global destruction.
Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
How the struggle between two political systems caused millions to suffer.
Spying was very much part of the Cold War.
And how a world was created which lived in constant fear. M.A.D World, mutually assured destruction. In this episode, World War II comes to an end. But the result is not world peace. Tensions soar. Territories are seized. A new weapon and new frontiers mark the start of the Cold War. The rise of the superpowers. Germany surrendered in May 1945, leaving Japan alone, still fighting the Allies. Terrible destruction descended.
Where there had been a distinct city below us, there was nothing down there but what, in my vernacular, was a black, boiling mess.
Most of the city appears to have been obliterated. 4 square miles of desolation are reported.
And that cloud up above it was just tumbling and rolling. You could see the energy that was in it.
Hiroshima, the 6th of August, 1945. Perhaps as many as 70,000 people are instantly killed by just one single bomb.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
Was very hard-headed, including about, not losing troops in Japan, so he dropped, made the decision to drop the atom bomb once he knew about it.
There is more to come.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. All of you who see this picture can judge for yourselves the extent of the menace to civilization of this new weapon.
It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
The bomb has been used on human beings twice.
It was a global world-scale war, so I think there's a very strong argument that the use of those weapons to end the war quickly without having to address a conventional invasion of Japan, very legitimate.
Discover the past with exclusive history documentaries from History Hit and uncover the secrets of some of the most famous people and events in history. History Hit brings you the stories that shaped the world through exclusive documentaries from the world's top historians. Travel with us to the bloody Battle of Stalingrad or uncover the lives of the people who called Pompeii home. We also aim to bring you the stories and legends that shaped our world through our award-winning podcast network. Sign up now for a free trial, and Timeline fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code TIMELINE at checkout.
The USA celebrates the new superweapon. They are the only nation that possesses the bomb. Something horrific has been invented, and it cannot be uninvented.
I don't think nuclear weapons were necessary to bring a swift end to World War II. Japanese scholars are now almost unanimous in saying, no, it was not Hiroshima and Nagasaki that led us to sue for peace. It was Russia's entry into the war that same week. That was the decisive factor. The one great achievement of nuclear weapons in most people's mind, that it did save a catastrophically prolonged war on the Japanese landmass, even that disappears on closer evaluation.
Will this power, now available to man, bring another, even more suicidal war upon us? Or can it be made to rule out war and open a new, progressive chapter of history, the atomic age?
The weapons used to end the Cold War with Japan marked the beginning of a new conflict. It is a conflict where astronomical amounts of money will be spent on weapons. It will last nearly 50 years. And if it escalates, it will mark the end of human civilization. It is the Cold War.
This is Movietone, rejoicing with you in victory.
3 months earlier in Europe, VE Day. Victory has been won over Germany. Its evil leader, Adolf Hitler, is dead. 6 years of horrendous suffering have come to a close. World War II is almost over. As the guns in Europe go silent, a meeting in the USA aims to ensure a war like the last one never happens again.
San Francisco, where 50 United Nations have been working for 8 weeks to produce a charter on which the future of world peace will depend.
It is now my duty to call for a vote on the approval of the Charter of the United Nations.
Dr. Wellington Koo signed first for China. Then, one by one, all the countries represented at San Francisco signed the Charter of Freedom and Peace on which the hopes of the whole world are centered.
This new structure of peace is rising upon strong foundations. Let us not fail to grasp this supreme chance to establish a worldwide rule of reason, to create an enduring peace under the guidance of God.
The United Nations is born. 50 nations sign the charter. Russia joins the pledge for world peace. Despite fears for the future, it is a moment of great optimism.
Men and women chosen to represent the vast majority of mankind in this new effort to make life safe for the ordinary citizen throughout the globe. In a disillusioned world, some may think such a task impossible. But given goodwill, it is of course not impossible, and the alternative is world destruction.
Two turning points in history create the Cold War. The atomic bomb is one. The second threatens to start another worldwide nuclear war.
Communism is based on the belief that man is so weak and inadequate that he is unable to govern himself and therefore requires the rule of strong masters.
Communism, a revolutionary form of government in Russia since 1917.
Moscow's Red Square was the spacious and impressive setting for the Red Army's first victory parade.
The Cold War was actually a confrontation of two ideologies, communism versus capitalism. Simple as that.
Well, I thought communism was, in theory, better than democracy, but unfortunately, as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst of all forms of government except for all the rest.
Russia was always a doubtful partner for the Allies. Communist ideology here is at odds with capitalism. The totalitarian state is at odds with Western democracy.
Brainwashed, educated at school to hate the West. The fat, big capitalists were bent on conquering the USSR.
Known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics since the revolution, Russia is ruled by Joseph Stalin, General Secretary of the Communist Party.
This great leader of the proletariat, who was a genius of all times.
Today, Stalin watches with pride as units of the Red Air Force fly over the Soviet capital.
Stalin has big plans for communism. He's already made a move at the Allied Peace Conference just before the close of World War II.
The Livadia Palace at Yalta was the scene of the conference, a sumptuous-looking place which used to be occupied by the Tsar when he took a winter holiday in the Crimea.
Yalta, plans are made to divide Europe between the four victorious parties: Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union. Germany will be divided in four. The eastern part will be run by the USSR. Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt acknowledged that Eastern Europe, occupied by the Red Army, is Stalin's.
It is crazy. And the whole partitioning of the world between the great powers, as you know, in Yalta, when they got together and they've kind of had this little piece of paper in which they scribbled, 70% of Poland to you, 20% to us, and all that, So, we've got to where we've got.
I think the government, because of the sickness of Roosevelt and the ascension to power of President Truman, trying to learn to deal with Stalin and Churchill, led to some belief that the Russians would treat the Eastern European better.
The Polish election was a test. The Soviets pledged a free democratic election in Poland. There was wrangling and delay, and when the election was finally held, it was a totalitarian affair staged by a Red dictatorship. Red Marshal Tito established a communist dictatorship in Yugoslavia. Hungarian Premier Nagy, whose democratic government was overthrown by the communists, a culminating violation of Soviet pledges of democratic liberty.
There was a rigged election in Hungary, which the communists rigged, or the Soviets rigged, and the communists came to power, and Hungary became part of the Soviet orbit.
One after the other, Eastern European nations come under direct Soviet control.
You took it for granted. Soviets have liberated Europe, and therefore, we've liberated them from capitalists, from any other kind of ambiguity about who they were.
Winston Churchill publicizes a name for the line dividing communist Eastern Europe from the West.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Well, I think the Iron Curtain was a very big surprise, a very unpleasant surprise. I think it led to the famous speech by Churchill to wake up the Americans that despite all the costs and the great victory of World War II, there now seemed to be some people who wanted to cause more trouble, to create another warlike situation, and that country that was going to do that was the Soviet Union.
The United States makes an attempt to revive Europe with the Marshall Plan. This financial support project offers to include the Eastern Bloc countries as well as the USSR. Ordinary Americans get involved.
The Citizens Food Committee in America had been asking for public donations of staple foodstuffs.
He is giving generously, as are thousands young and old who wish to aid our friends abroad who face either untold suffering or communist control.
The Friendship Train, an idea sparked by a Washington journalist that inspires generosity across the USA.
During its journey across the continent. Everywhere, great crowds turned out to endorse this expression of America's goodwill and practical aid for the free nations of Western Europe.
In addition to milk, canned goods, and other food products, gifts of money have been collected. Stockton, California is another stop on the Friendship route, over which the railroads are carrying the train at no cost as their part of the gift grant.
The train travels from coast to coast, collecting food, fuel, and clothes, making over 40 stops on the way.
New carloads of vital supplies are coupled on at each stop, and the train is expected to arrive in New York in 2 sections, hauling 200 cars.
The cargo, valued at about $40 million, is shipped to France and given out across Europe in support of the Marshall Plan. But Stalin refuses to allow Marshall aid in his communist world.
Recriminations and refusal. Molotov quitting the conference and denouncing the Marshall Plan. The cleavage between West and East becomes an economic division. The line of the Iron Curtain now separates Western and Soviet economic spheres as the representatives of the free nations of the West go ahead without Russia. The big powers invite all Europe to join the parley. All Soviet satellites reject.
You know, when we were leaving Lithuania, my parents initially thought they would do it legitimately. So they went to the Russian consulate and asked for permission to leave. And the answer they got, it says, listen, nothing leaves. Even the birds are not going to fly out if we can figure out how to stop them.
Barbed wire and watchtowers have closed off the East. The Soviet threat is real. The Cold War has begun. The USA believes Stalin wants to take over Europe and China. Fear of a third world war grows. President Truman decides to build more atomic bombs. The first will be tested in the Pacific Ocean on a tiny group of islands known as the Bikini Atoll.
On Bikini itself, giant towers are being built for photographic observation.
This will be the first atomic bomb explosion since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is a dangerous experiment. No one knows exactly what will happen. The U.S. military is determined the details of its super weapon will remain strictly secret.
The atom bomb, carefully screened, is wheeled to the B-29 that's about to carry it to Bikini. Not even a glimpse of this epoch-making missile is permitted.
The bomb is named Gilda, after a Rita Hayworth movie.
And now it's time to go. Mission Crossroads has begun. Those without goggles shielded their eyes with their arms as the world's fourth atom bomb fell. Following the colossal flash, a great cloud rose 7 miles up into the sky. All can judge for themselves that the world is certainly at the crossroads.
The second bomb is tested 2 weeks later. This time, it will be 27 meters underwater.
Two minutes to go. Dr. Holloway moves a switch, lights flash.
The bomb is named Helen of Bikini.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fire! Radiation, smoke, fire, steam, water, a pattern of irresistible power recorded by a Movietone cameraman, among many others, recorded for all the world to see as thousands of tons of water swirling upward, a picture that epitomizes the colossal energy released.
The U.S. and its close allies were in possession of a weapon capability in the form of a nuclear deterrent that clearly had strategic implications.
An air view of an explosion equal to 50,000 tons of TNT. Scientists compute the temperature in the center of the atomic typhoon as 100 million degrees.
The temperatures generated will melt steel and vaporize anything living. In a polarized world, the USA has a massive military advantage. Aggression towards the West is growing behind the Iron Curtain. U.S. employees of an oil company are lucky to get out of Hungary.
We were apprehended. We're taken down to this rather famous city station and questioned, sometimes not too pleasantly, and we spent the next week there.
But nationals of the country occupied by Stalin are barred from leaving their country.
They were not so much terrified as frustrated by the lack of freedoms and the lack of democracy.
The jokes, and there were many, many of them, which were quite cutting and dismissive of Stalin. You know, I'll just tell you a tiny little one, you know, when there is somebody drowning and they get him out of the lake, and this person says, "You can ask me for anything you want. I'm Stalin." And they said, "Only please don't tell anybody that we've saved you."
Attempts to escape are daring and sometimes bizarre.
This is the homemade tank used by a Czech mechanic to escape to Bavaria. Crashing through the electrified wire after a 30-mile drive to the frontier, he took his wife and 2 children with him, as well as a number of others who joined in his bold and successful bid for freedom.
It's a risky business nowadays trying to escape from Soviet-held East Germany to the safety of the West, but thousands have been making the attempt.
At that time, it was extremely difficult and dangerous because the borders were closed with electrified fences. landmines. It was extremely difficult to get out.
The dramatic story of the 3 Czech planes that recently landed at Erding in the American zone of Germany, some 20 miles from Munich, is a story of escape to freedom.
So Mr. Kautsky here, who took the plane up from Prague airport and who has force landed it on the airfield, well, I should say on the strip outside of Prague. It took about 90 seconds before all of us were embarked, and immediately we took off. About 20 minutes later, we have crossed the border into the American territory.
Some of the refugees from communism are more than they seem.
In Newark, New Jersey, there's a radio factory worker who's escaped from behind the real Iron Curtain. He's Jonas Chernius, once Premier of Lithuania, who got away with his family when his country was taken over by Soviet Russia. How do you feel about it all, Mr. Chernius?
I am feeling very well. I am free. I have found very good friends and relatives. I have to eat. I am not more hungry. I am very happy.
People in the West are both scared and intrigued by the closed world behind the Iron Curtain. Reports reveal Soviet-controlled countries are training their young people for war. Information is hard to get, but life in the East seems austere.
The ancient city of Belgrade, modern Yugoslavia's capital, presents a picture of particular interest, for it offers a glimpse of a country in Eastern Europe, which is today a focus of curiosity for Western eyes. From the peasants who come here to do their shopping, one gets an impression of sturdy types, some recalling the days when Serbia was a separate kingdom.
In Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate marks the boundary between East and West. But filming beyond the Iron Curtain was recently permitted. The once famous Unter den Linden now has a very new look, and our cameraman made these notes of the kind of shops and stores they've got. Street names, of course, have changed since Stalin and his comrades took over this part of the former German capital.
The Soviets occupied Eastern Europe purportedly to help them, and then they were going to withdraw and they weren't going to leave large troops stationed there. Turns out that they did, and as a result, in 1947, the Soviets were not going to leave Eastern Europe and let those people have their own country.
Getting stories is risky for Western journalists. Many are arrested for their efforts.
Freed after more than 2 years in a red jail, Mr. Otis was reunited with his wife on arrival at Idlewild Airport, New York. It's said that it was largely due to her personal appeal that the Czech government finally agreed to liberate him.
Bill, do you feel that the Czechs had any justification at all in arresting you?
That's pretty tough, too. That's complicated, too.
Did you feel...
And I'll tell you what. From their point of view, in certain respects, they had.
They did have?
Yes, that's true.
Could you explain?
The standards are different there. They look at things in a different way.
Most people in the West are disturbed about the growing oppression in the East.
If the Soviet Union really wants peace, it can prove it by lifting the Iron Curtain and permitting the free exchange of information and ideas.
The Summer Olympics in Helsinki are rocked by the Cold War. This event, designed to bring nations together, is also ripped apart.
Helsinki, Finland's capital, is certainly a fine-looking town, and it was all ready for the games when we took these views near the Olympic Stadium with the swimming pool in the background.
The Eastern Bloc athletes are kept separate from their Western rivals.
Some 10 miles away is the so-called Iron Curtain Village, where teams from Russia and satellite nations are housed. Here's the camp manager with some Hungarian girl athletes. Everywhere, of course, Iron Curtain signs are in evidence.
The world realizes that the Cold War frontiers are here for the long term. Not everyone in the West is against communism. Guerrillas in Southern Europe seek a communist takeover. They are funded by the USSR.
In Greece, a more dangerous crisis. Civil war developed. Greek government troops trying to suppress red guerrilla bands, aided by Soviet satellite countries Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria.
The Greek government states that these gangs have been sponsored and trained mostly by Yugoslavia, that their object is terrorism and loot, and that there are well-known criminals among them.
The very existence of the Greek state is today threatened by the terrorist activities of several thousand armed men led by communists.
The Security Council hears the case of Greece. Mr. Saldaris, the Premier, charges Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Albania with inciting a leftist rebellion.
The United States has received from the Greek government an urgent appeal for financial and economic assistance. Greece must have assistance if it is to become a self-supporting and self-respecting democracy.
The United States did not particularly want to get back involved in war or back involved in a European nation's business, was forced to do so because of the recognition that without the help from the big country here, that the Greeks would go under and communism would spread even further.
The USA pours in money, arms, and advisors to stop the spread of communism.
Fighting in Greece has gone on pretty continuously ever since World War II ended. It is, of course, part of the worldwide communistic plan.
Well, I think the likelihood of Soviet bases in the Mediterranean and in Greek ports, the ability of the Soviet Union to project power into North Africa, into the Middle East, would have been stronger, which is one reason I think the United States helped them.
In Greece, heavy operations have been carried out against communist rebel strongholds around the Grammos Mountains near the Albanian frontier.
Greece is the first case in the Cold War when a small nation is used as a proxy by the two superpowers. It is the first Cold War shooting war. The USA against the USSR. Capitalism against communism.
During the Civil War, you were on the right side or the left side. People who were on the left side, they went up to the mountains to hide and fight. I was born in Sparta, 1938. We lived in fear. My father kept his position neutral. He didn't want to be involved with any other parties. Civil war is a very sad thing. And actually, it's a dangerous thing because you fight for an idea. You don't fight for your whole country. It was brother against brother.
The pictures that follow illustrate his complaint of what is going on in Western Macedonia. Refugees moving away from the mountainous districts where the rebels are said to be operating from well-established camps, and Greek regulars on their way to engage and round up the gangs described as bandits. On February the 10th, some 600 Greek rebels attacked in the direction of Salonika. They were defeated by regular troops. Half of them were killed and about 120 were taken prisoner.
We used to walk to school. A police station was very close by our school. And as we really reached the gate, I turned around, and to my horror, there were heads outside the police station. Quite a few heads, just the heads outside, and the scary faces. And I was too scared to turn around and look again. It was just the heads. What they used to do that to tell people, well, if you go with the left side, that's what's going to happen to you.
A number of women were among those captured. none of whom seemed to be in very good shape nor to have anything much in the way of equipment. After being rounded up, they were marched through the streets of Salonika, escorted by government soldiers and followed by large and excited crowds of civilians.
One day there was a lot of noise, a tractor stopped outside the house, and I was curious, I wanted to see. So I went outside, and what I remember is that beautiful hair that it was just flowing from the back of the truck. There were about 3 bodies there. I didn't know there were bodies then. So this woman probably went to the mountains to help maybe their relatives, maybe their loved ones, and they caught them and they killed them. Because the other countries interfere, it creates chaotic situation, and it lasted for some time. It lasted for longer than it should have been, and it's unfair.
After 4 years, the communists are defeated.
The Greeks probably would not have been able to win the Civil War in 1947 by themselves.
The West has prevented Stalin from gaining another toehold in Europe. The 2,500-year-old Acropolis stands witness to the end of another war in its long history.
The sailors lost no time in visiting the Acropolis, where they were entertained to a display of dancing by the Greek army. Watching this, it's hard to realize that the F-zones are among the toughest fighters in the world. But the real fun came when the American visitors were asked to join in. Obviously, this Greek version of the Palais Glide was a bit complicated for mere jitterbug fans to master all at once.
Communist forces attempt a similar outcome on the other side of the world.
I wish to express my appreciation for the interests and sympathy shown to my country, China, by our American friends.
The United States faced a very difficult decision in trying to keep China from being communist. There had been a civil war going on between the forces of the communists, Mao Zedong, and the nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek.
Life for ordinary people in China is brutal and primitive. It's not hard for the communists to gain followers in their fight against the government.
Manpower and manpower alone hauls the boats upstream and over the rapids with cheerleaders to encourage the men.
The communists in Russia and in China both were able to hypnotize and to propagandize and to convince, persuade the peasants in their countries, the poor people, that they had been taken advantage of, that the rich people had all the money, all the counts and the princes and the upper level people were corrupt. As far as the peasants were concerned, if the communists took over and shot everybody that had money, you know, at that point they were so beaten down and brutalized and had nothing to look forward to that they figured, well, you know, why not give that a try?
The USA is determined to prevent a communist China and aid the armies of Chiang Kai-shek.
The battle for the city of Suzhou is joined. Less than 180 miles from the capital, Nanking, nationalist forces dig in for a losing fight. The 400,000 nationalists are armed largely with American weapons, and 105mm guns open a barrage.
Just as in Greece, the war in China is a superpower struggle. The USA supports the nationalist anti-communist government, and the USSR supports the communists.
The siege of the town lasted for some time, and rice had to be brought in by air. Planes rushed up supplies for the defenders of the city and flew out the wounded, though latest reports tell of 20,000 casualties eventually abandoned in the retreat. The military situation from the nationalist point of view is very grave. They claim that the communists are kept supplied by the USSR, saying that the Chinese Reds captured in the battle were armed with modern military equipment from Russia. Today, communism has swept like a red tide over this ancient civilization from the old capital of Peking down to the Yangtze and Nanking.
I was born in China, in Shanghai actually. Western democratic sort of system couldn't work in China. If you look at the history, you know.
On the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong proclaims the People's Republic of China.
There probably are some that would make the argument that China is better for having communism than if it had had a corrupt democracy. That's arguable. I would have preferred a corrupt democracy that we tried to help become less corrupt.
Those years, my time in China, when the Mao Zedong was ruling, of course it's a dictatorship, right? You could say nothing apart from long live Chairman Mao, or love China, or love Communist Party, you know, all the songs, the music, and everything in the school books, everything was like that. But it was a simple life. The relationship between people were warmer, and the moral sense was better.
While the map turns red in the east, the Soviets make another move, right in the heart of Europe. Post-World War II Germany is now two very different states. Berlin, the old capital, is isolated in Russian-occupied East Germany. Just like Germany itself, the city is divided into East and West zones.
After the destruction of Berlin and the end of World War II, it was agreed between the victorious powers that the German capital should be divided into zones for the purpose of occupation by Britain, America, France, and Russia.
To supply Berlin, there were 3 land corridors which were guaranteed by treaty, and a rail corridor between Magdeburg and Berlin.
But Berlin was 110 miles inside of the Russian sector of East Germany. They wanted us out of the city.
1948, and the city is about to be held ransom. West Germany is part of the Western European economy. The Allies launch a new currency, cementing West Germany's emergence as an independent state. Stalin retaliates. He orders his troops to seal off roads to the German capital. The Berlin blockade begins.
I was stationed in Germany when the Berlin airlift started. This was an attempt by the Russians to get us out of Berlin.
Marshal Sokolovsky's shutdown of all service transport between the sectors brought Berlin's railways to a stop.
And that was one way they applied pressure, where they blocked off all entrances, rail, air, and Autobahn.
The famous autobahns were deserted, and even canal traffic was at a standstill.
Soviet brutality has been clearly demonstrated across Eastern Europe. Many fear for the lives of West Berliners.
There was only one way open to the beleaguered capital, by air. And at Western Zone airfields, supplies were loaded aboard transports which had been rushed to the scene.
The U.S. government decided we will keep millions of people supplied by air, and the airlift started.
Aircraft had limited carrying capacity in those days and very slow. It started off with the aircraft taking coal, other fuel, food, medical supplies, clothing, whatever, up to sustain the Berliners. After a very short time, it was realized that this just wasn't sufficient.
As winter approaches, something needs to happen fast. The British and American Air Forces come up with a plan.
In order to increase the number of sorties, they had a system where the aircraft would take off from West Germany, fly up the corridor, and land, offload the fuel, and take off straight away. They had enough fuel to get back.
The flight of over 150 miles over Russian territory was accomplished by relays of British and American aircraft, which landed at about 3-minute intervals throughout the night and day.
It's been estimated that 24 hours of the airlift is equivalent in organization and effort to launching a 1,000-bomb array.
There were many, probably hundreds of lives lost, British and American mainly, just through crashes or bad weather or running out of fuel or whatever. So it was costly.
America and Britain prepare for the worst.
Here's the first of the superforts coming into land at Scampton, Lincolnshire. Altogether, 2 B-29 groups comprising 60 superforts were on their way, each aircraft carrying regular and spare crews. In addition, one of them brought a Pomeranian, a mask it may be, or a watchdog.
A B-29 dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The B-29 squadron sent to Britain are within range of Moscow.
Asked about the object of their visit, Colonel John Henry, the group commander, said this.
The purpose of our visit is a long-range training flight. We don't know exactly how long we'll be here. We'll be here for a short period of temporary duty.
The threat to the Soviet Union is clear.
We have a right to be in Berlin, and we intend to maintain that right.
We have, of course, a situation in Berlin which may at any time precipitate a hideous world struggle.
It had the possibility of escalating and spinning out of control. It could be a limited confrontation, or it could be all-out war.
The world holds its breath. Will the Americans use their superweapon?
The Security Council of the United Nations is now facing its greatest test, the question of the Berlin dispute between Russia and the Western powers.
In East Berlin, the communists organized demonstrations against being threatened by the bomb.
With a never-ending display of force, German communists parade through Potsdamer Platz, carrying banners which sing the hymn of hate against the Western powers, with particular attention to the United States. With the battered Reichstag as a backdrop, Berlin citizens again gather more than 200,000 strong to hear reassurances that Berlin will be held at all costs.
West Berliners need supplies airlifted from the west to survive. They plan to double the capacity of the Gatow city airport.
Berlin itself, as everyone knows, is in ruins, but an excellent use has recently been made of some of the great masses of rubble contained in the city. German men and women have been working away, loading the stuff into lorries for transport to Gatow airfield, where the making of a new runway has been a priority job. The first Dakota to take off from the new runway marked a real triumph.
The Americans saw that the children had nothing to do with the war, and a lot of their aircraft coming in had sweets and candies and stuff in the cockpits, and as they approached to land, they'd throw these out of the aircraft, and there'd be hungry German children underneath, gathering them up.
Then, with no warning, On the 12th of May, 1949, the Berlin blockade ends.
The hottest spot in the Cold War is eliminated, at least temporarily, as the blockade is lifted by the Russians. Allied vehicles await the removal of the barriers and the signal for the dash to Berlin.
Stalin realized that, the West was not going to give in, and it all just stopped overnight.
With the opening of the gates, a new chapter in post-war history begins to unroll down German highways.
Food and other supplies again flow freely into the city. The airlift has kept 3 million people alive. No bombs were dropped. The first major European Cold War crisis is over. But it is just the beginning. For the next 40 years, the world will live in constant fear of annihilation. Summer 1949. The USA is the only country in the world in possession of the atomic bomb. Each one can vaporize over 70,000 people. The USSR has the largest armed forces in the world. Many believe they plan to use them to expand their territory.
I must not conceal from you tonight the truth as I see it. It is certain that Europe would have been communized like Czechoslovakia and London under bombardment some time ago, but for the deterrent of the atomic bomb in the hands of the United States.
Competitive advantage is a very difficult thing to keep, whether it's a business, a person, country.
The atomic bomb makes the West feel safe. That secure feeling is about to be blown away.
The stunning news has the atom bomb and has exploded it bursts on America.
Russia's first bomb is codenamed First Lightning. It is detonated on the 29th of August, 1949, in what is now Kazakhstan.
You got that sense of humanity being in danger of annihilation. Stalin knew about it. Russians were already working on a similar kind of a project and were provided some information by their own spies and by willing parties in the United States who felt that the Cold War had to be a bit more balanced, that they didn't like the fact that America was the only one possessing the superweapon.
It may well have taken them another 5 or 10 years to develop that capability on their own.
Now Russia has the secret. It was, of course, inevitable, but President Truman's announcement came as a bit of a shock to many of us.
People in the West are chilled by the news of the Soviet bomb. Their cities are now under the shadow of this horrific weapon.
One immediate effect of the announcement of Russia's atom blast is to tighten security regulations at all atom installations. Ground guards are kept on their toes by constant target practice, and they have orders to shoot to kill at any suspicious stranger. Every inch of the Hanford plant is patrolled from the air, and for the most up-to-date roadblock, watch the following scenes.
Now the Soviets have the bomb. The Cold War has begun in earnest. Both sides have the means to destroy entire cities with one stroke.
It was the cornerstone of mutually assured destruction.
The Soviet Union and its agents have destroyed the independence and democratic character of a whole series of nations in Eastern and Central Europe.
But will the USSR stop there? Troops are building up in Eastern Europe. Are they there to enforce Soviet domination, or are they preparing to attack?
It is this ruthless course of action and the clear design to extend it to the remaining free nations of Europe that have brought about the critical situation in Europe today.
The countries of Western Europe are too small to defend themselves if attacked. A pact is drawn up to use U.S. military might to protect Western Europe.
Representatives of Europe's anti-communist nations recently met Mr. Atchison, America's Secretary of State, to discuss military aspects of the North Atlantic Pact in Washington.
NATO vital. It had various clauses, and Clause 4 stated if one NATO nation is attacked, it is, in effect, declaring war on the whole of NATO, and all of NATO countries will come to the defense of that country and deter the aggressor.
12 nations sign NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
In Washington, the signing ceremony of the North Atlantic Treaty was inaugurated by Secretary of State Dean Acheson.
I welcome warmly to our country and our capital the foreign ministers who have assembled here to sign the North Atlantic Treaty.
Our peoples do not want war and do not glorify war, but they will not shrink from it if aggression is threatened.
The NATO alliance unifies the armed forces of Western Europe into one giant military force. The USSR sees it as preparation for war.
There are those who claim that this treaty is an aggressive act on the part of the nations which ring the North Atlantic. That is absolutely untrue. For us, war is not inevitable.
American arms and men are moved to Europe.
We had to work on their territory, so there was greater cooperation. And in general, it was a good countermeasure to the superiority of weapons and people that the Soviet Warsaw Pact had. The Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact forces were not happy about NATO. They would have preferred NATO was not as strong or as united.
Britain, France, and their allies now have access to the latest in American military technology.
Here's an enlarged 16mm film of an ejector seat demonstration by the American Air Force. The fast speeds at which jet planes now travel make ordinary bailing out impractical.
The Americans call this Tarzan the Bullseye bomb. Although at first sight it may look like any other blockbuster, you'll soon see how it differs as a B-29 Superfort takes it up for target practice. The bomb, in fact, is a radio-directed missile. Watch it on the way down and you'll see it move over to the right in response to remote control. But will it hit the bullseye? Yes, there's absolutely no doubt about that. It's right on the beam.
June 1950. Atomic bombs will be shipped across the Pacific, ready for use. Since the end of World War II, the nation of Korea has been divided. The communist North and the capitalist South.
South Korea, of course, was a dictatorship, and there were many people languishing in political prisons.
Both sides want a united Korea on their terms.
There'd been lots of saber rattling on both sides. So both the North had been, threatening to invade, and the South had also been, threatening to march to Pyongyang and so on.
South Korean villages awoke to a world suddenly filled with noise and plague. The communists, made bold by months of small-scale raiding across the 38th parallel, had finally launched their undeclared, all-out war of conquest.
The North is allied with the Soviet Union. Pro-USA South Korea is caught unprepared.
Soldiers of the South Korean army are here seen on their way to the front. Hopelessly equipped against the Russian-armed northern communists, they fought a delaying action as best they could.
Spearheaded by tanks, the Red forces had moved swiftly. In 2 days, they were attacking the capital city itself.
The Korean War was actually the Cold War getting a little hot.
Seoul is quickly captured by the North Koreans. The United Nations is not even 5 years old, but it responds immediately. Within 2 days, the order goes out to send UN troops into Korea.
A United Nations force was created, although it was very much directed by the United States.
UN involvement was critical because it gave us legitimacy.
The peoples of the free world, acting under the United Nations, have given their answer, and the United States, in a swift, bold decision, has already gone into action.
So the United Nations actually, very soon after its creation, becomes a combatant in a war. It's not in a peacekeeping role, it's actually on one side in the war. And that has very long-term implication.
Throughout the free world, these moves to halt the Reds are welcomed, whatever the consequences.
Despite the bravado, the United Nations frontline troops are dangerously undersupplied.
We were not prepared. We found ourselves outmaneuvered, out-equipped.
But soon, more troops from across the globe arrive.
The British were the first United Nations troops to reinforce the Americans.
They go to play their very important part in the latest battle against communist domination.
My elder brother fought in the Korean War as a national service soldier. But he doesn't say much about it because it was real hell.
Support from the USSR for North Korea quickly becomes obvious.
Here's the North Korean pilot who flew across in a Russian-built MiG-15 jet fighter to surrender to the United Nations.
Also in the bag is this Russian-built armored car, together with a 76mm field gun. Those markings clearly show its Soviet origin.
This is not just a Korean war, it is a proxy war, a struggle between the USSR and the West on Korean soil.
I'd like to ask whose troops are attacking deep in the country of somebody else? Who has the influence and the power to call off the invading Northern Korean army? The Soviet Union.
A tenth of the Korean population will die. Soldiers from 16 UN member countries will serve, from the UK and Canada to Turkey, Thailand, and the Philippines. Tens of thousands of troops from all over the world will be killed or seriously injured.
I saw 3 tanks. They cut loose with machine gun fire, shooting my left forearm completely off. I fell on the ground and was trying to crawl away when I noticed one of the Red crawl out of his tank and came up over me and fired 3 shots down at my chest, and which one of them came out in the front.
Then, a surprising turnaround.
One of Movitone's cameramen flew with a recent mission carrying supplies to a United Nations battalion completely surrounded by the enemy. Ammunition, food, and water were accurately dropped by parachute.
Less than 6 months into the war, the UN troops have the upper hand.
First pictures of the reoccupation of Seoul by South Koreans show Marines of the Republic engaged in street actions. Following the brilliant work of the American Marine Advance Guards, these troops were mopping up stragglers, interrogating and searching North Koreans throughout the city. The capture of Seoul had been a tough job, and it was inevitable that many civilian casualties should occur in the process. Some estimates indeed have put them at over 20,000.
And now, with United Nations sanction, comes the crossing of the 38th parallel to finish the story of North Korean aggression.
As UN troops surge forward, reports from the front line are full of confidence.
The shattered communist forces are pulling back into the last corner of this peninsula they had set out to conquer. UN troops follow as fast as the tortuous terrain and increasing cold will allow.
UN troops overrun most of North Korea, all the way to the border with China, the Yalu River.
The village of Haisanjin huddles against the banks of the Yalu across from Manchuria. Here, men of the 7th Division set up their outposts.
The tide has indeed turned suddenly. All honor to the American soldier and his officers who have achieved such resounding victories so swiftly.
December 1950. Everyone thinks the war is nearly over. Even the incredible cold does not seem such a threat.
The Korean winter was now setting in pretty fast. Witness the fact that paddy fields had become skating rinks.
But the threat to these soldiers, Korea, and the entire safety of the world is building on the horizon. The next move will take the world to the edge of nuclear war.
The unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III.
The problem was that once the UN and US forces marched north, then they continued up towards the Chinese border, and China was quite reluctant to get involved in many ways. If you think about it, it makes sense. They'd only just come out of a terribly destructive civil war of their own. But as soon as they felt that their sovereignty might be threatened, then they came in.
The manpower resources of the Chinese military surge forward.
Down there below are some 20,000 American troops, somehow withstanding the bitter cold and driving snowstorms, encircled by hordes of Chinese communist forces in the hills. Yes, just about as hard and perilous a situation as it's possible to imagine. Casualties were heavy, both from enemy fire and from frostbite, and large numbers were evacuated by air.
It's also a terrible place to wage war, because the hills are murder for infantry. And the other thing is it's cold. Cold weather was hard on us.
As the communists moved south toward Daejeon, we pulled back across the Kun River.
All seems lost for South Korea. Despite the support from fighter planes, the UN forces make a costly retreat.
The 29th Brigade took the main shock of the Chinese offensive at the end of April, and the stand of the Gloucesters and the mortar troop saved the situation. Only about 50 of the battalion got back out of 600.
The Korean War becomes a massacre. And not just for the military.
For hundreds of thousands of civilians trying desperately to outrun the advancing communists, the journey southward was a nightmare of cold, weariness, and confusion. The children who had no part in the causes of war received full measure of its hardships just the same.
Terrible things that were done on both sides. I think we have to say that in retrospect, certainly. I mean, many massacres on both sides of the border. It's particularly part of the problem of having a war that was both a civil war and an international war, and in a way a kind of proxy Third World War. So the civilians bore the brunt of the suffering.
In In spite of all difficulties, more than 1,000 Korean orphans were evacuated by air. As a 5th Air Force chaplain explained, we just couldn't leave those kids there to die.
One of the sad parts of non-combatants caught in the middle of a conflict or battle is they're pretty much on their own. While the man and woman in uniform has at their disposal ambulances, hospitals, medication, evacuation systems that takes you all the way back to the States, none of that is available for the civilians. Once you decide to go to war, that is one of the problems that you will have to face with. Many civilians will die.
Something has to be done. Something drastic.
We are fighting to keep the forces of communist aggression from making a slave state out of Korea. We are building up our strength in concert with other free nations to meet the danger of aggression that has been turned loose on the world. The strength of the free nations is the world's best hope of peace.
By the end of 1950, the U.S. has 369 atomic bombs ready for action. But the United States did not know how many have been built in the Soviet Union.
We are willing, as we have always been, to negotiate honorable settlements with the Soviet Union. But we will not engage in appeasement.
While most people in the West are celebrating Christmas, President Truman has a terrible dilemma. Should the destructive power of nuclear weapons prevent their use? Or has the time come when military necessity takes precedent?
The President has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia.
Well, the stakes are very high. Nuclear weapons are part of the considerations. It was just a choreographed situation that was possibly spinning out of control.
Truman makes the unthinkable decision. Atomic bombs are secretly transferred to U.S. bases in the Western Pacific. The U.S. are preparing to drop them on cities and military bases in China.
There were certainly people within the US who strongly favored using atomic weapons. Obviously, in a situation of war like that, there's always a risk.
If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
It is no exaggeration to say that that problem is the gravest one now confronting the world.
There's a very real fear that nuclear warfare in Korea could lead to Soviet attacks in Europe. Truman delays.
His hope is that the employment of this devastating weapon will be unnecessary. But the final hope lies with the United Nations.
As war in Korea rages, questions are asked. How did the Soviets get hold of the atomic secret?
Morton Sobel, the principal in America's first atomic spy trial, leaves New York's federal court.
The unseen war of spying and counter-spying, which goes on all the time. It's a war that sometimes pops up in the public and sometimes doesn't, but it's a very important part of a nation's preparedness for defending its independence.
Spies. The undercover world of deception and double agents is the battleground of the Cold War.
He's accused with Julius Rosenberg, electrical engineer, of conspiring to give Russia vital secrets of the atom bomb.
Many of the top engineers and scientists, such as the Rosenbergs, had grown up in New York and were very much part of the socialist, international, and leftist circles.
Harry Gold is seen here in Philadelphia just after he'd been granted postponement of extradition to New York for trial. He's accused of passing atomic secrets to Russia.
And an American woman, Judith Copeland, employed by the Department of Justice, was arrested with typed copies of secret documents.
The ability of the Soviets to obtain atomic bomb secrets and intelligence was one of the great successes of the Soviets and failures of American intelligence.
The USA and other Western countries are democracies. Their citizens support a range of political views. Some believe in communism.
People who had sympathies for that particular philosophy, and so that led Soviet espionage to a number of these people working on the Manhattan Project, and they were able to recruit them and to obtain their cooperation, sometimes not for money, but on the basis of you can't afford to let one power have this capability.
A new and counterintuitive theory forms that the world might actually be a more stable place now that both sides possess the atomic bomb.
You could argue that having deterrents on both sides actually creates some kind of guarantee that no one would use the first strike.
It is the morbid philosophy of the Cold War. Some turn traitor and actively support the USSR.
An obligation of every communist, a duty of any communist was to contribute to the world revolution, to turning the whole world into a socialist world.
Russians would kind of stick to bread and butter spying techniques, such as honey traps, women, money, drugs.
Then, shocking betrayal in Britain.
It was in May 1951 that a worldwide sensation was caused by the sudden disappearance of the missing diplomats, as they came to be called.
These diplomats are Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, two of what later emerge as the famous Cambridge Five ring of spies.
Burgess and Maclean defected, who knows really. They certainly weren't going to have a very enjoyable life had they stayed in the West.
It was believed they had gone to Russia, and this was later confirmed.
These were a group of spies, and it's really four that we know about. The fifth is only suspected, that are largely British, that were in possession of early secrets during and shortly after the Second World War relating to nuclear capability. They gave the secrets away to the Russians, and it was very damaging.
Along with Kim Philby, Anthony Blunt, and a mysterious fifth man, their actions add to Western government's sense of paranoia. Any communist is considered a traitor. Investigative committees and prosecutions in the USA, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, become hysterical.
Of course, as far as war is concerned, we're at war with the communist half of the world. That war wasn't started by us. It can't be ended by us except by ultimate victory.
Well, there's two or three kinds of spies. One kind is those that have official cover. In other words, they have a diplomatic passport. Then they're generally caught and declared persona non grata, which means they got 48 hours to get out of town and go back to Russia or come back over here. If they're more deep cover agents, a non-official cover, and they get caught, well, then they can get locked up for, 25, 30, 40 years.
The committee hearings become a witch hunt. Any American thought to have communist sympathies is accused of being a traitor.
Edward J. Fitzgerald. I refuse to answer this question on the grounds that any answer I may give may tend to be self-incriminating.
Hundreds of Americans go to jail. Thousands lose their jobs.
Do you think that you have been guilty of any un-Americanism yourself?
Fighting communists and getting a bit rough with them, Mr. Hurley, is un-American, then I must plead guilty to being un-American. Frankly, McCarthyism means calling a man a communist who is later proven to be one.
McCarthy probably was on the right theme, but it kind of got out of control and he became his own worst enemy.
McCarthyism ramps up the persecution of people with communist sympathies. But trials like this have been going on in the USA since World War II, spearheaded by the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
The mass media of the time is targeted, including the Hollywood movie industry.
Investigating alleged communism in Hollywood, the Washington Committee on Un-American Activities has been hearing the testimony of prominent film personalities.
Question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then
which
you,
invades his, absolutely invades
Then
his
you
right.
denied, you refused to answer that question. Is that correct?
I have told you that I will offer my beliefs, my affiliations.
Stand away from the stand.
Fight for the Bill of Rights which you are
Officer,
trying to
take
destroy.
this man away from the stand.
Yeah, paranoia associated with Soviet involvement, intelligence involvement, kind of reached a point of almost becoming debilitating.
In Korea, the Red Chinese have driven UN forces into full retreat. Then, the Chinese advance in Korea comes to a sudden halt. They have outrun their supply lines.
The Soviet Union was supposed to be supplying them with weapons, but the Chinese apparently were very discontented with the supply that was coming from the Soviet Union. There are stories of people in the Chinese People's Volunteers sharing a gun between them or having ancient weapons that didn't work properly.
Truman holds fire with his atomic weapons. The world lets out a long sigh of relief. American planes with conventional weapons batter the stalled Chinese forces.
Air power is beginning to exert its full influence on the course of the Korean campaign. B-29 superfortresses take off on a mass raid. We photograph wave after wave of bomb-dropping giants plastering a target.
The bombing raids on the North Korean cities were carried out using firebombing and napalm attacks. And these caused huge damage. A lot of the houses were very poorly built. They had, thatch roofs, and so they burnt very easily.
Much of Korea is almost bombed into oblivion.
The most concentrated air offensive since Normandy.
By mid-1951, armies of North and South Korea are facing each other pretty much where they'd started a year earlier. Peace talks begin.
Communist war correspondents and their United Nations opposite numbers evidently get along quite well, though the truce talks were reported at this time as being sticky. A few days later, the Red General Nam Il led his delegation to the site, followed by the United Nations party under Admiral Joy. Soon afterwards, it was reported that the communists had at last agreed to a ceasefire position related to the existing battlefront, but there were still complications.
One of the core problems was around prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention, really both sides were supposed to send the prisoners of war back to where they came from. But that actually was really complicated in the Korean War.
Many communist prisoners feel it's not safe to go home. some make a break for freedom.
3,600 of the communist prisoners took part in the insurrection, and the small United Nations garrison had to open fire or be overwhelmed.
The UN POWs are trapped in North Korea as hostages. Later reports reveal the atrocities committed in the prisons.
Well, I was taken into solitary confinement for organising escape committees and other illegal activities it whilst in the camp.
At various sorts of persecution, with boxes, beating up, bad food.
Yes, I lost the sight of my left eye, but I hope to get the sight back again in the near future.
Meanwhile, at the front, the carnage goes on. While the Red negotiators try by every means to hold up the talks, men of both sides are dying in the battle areas.
The elephant in the room is Stalin. He presses the Chinese to keep the war going so he can study the weapons and techniques of his Cold War enemies.
It's certainly clear that the Soviet Union took a very instrumentalist view of the Korean War. They were going to play it in the way that served their own interests best.
Now for a duel between a Panther, an American naval fighter, and a Russian-built MiG-15. First pictures of this Soviet jet fighter with swept-back wings, and it's the first time such a high-speed jet battle has been shown on the screen.
Nobody knew this at the time, but many of the MiG fighter pilots are not North Korean or Chinese. They are Russian. These dogfights are the first time the USA and the USSR come into direct combat during the Cold War. Cold War superpowers are fighting each other directly in the skies above Korea.
So yes, they sent pilots in. They provided a certain amount of equipment both to the North Koreans and the Chinese, but they were cautious not to send ground troops in, again, not in order not to cause that outbreak of a Third World War.
Then fate lends a hand.
When from Moscow news of the stroke that ended Stalin's life spread round the world, it was all the more startling because so unexpected. Now Moscow mourns a man who rose from humble origin to rule from the splendor of the Kremlin, holding sway not only over the USSR, but also over the satellite countries. The passing now of the man who had so long directed worldwide communism must have far deeper implications. There may be small reason to believe in a favorable change of Soviet policy, but it is always right to hope.
Stalin's successor is Georgy Malenkov, a man not known for his good nature. Against all expectations, Malenkov breaks the deadlock. Despite intransigence from South Korea, he moves to convince China and North Korea to end the war. In July 1953, an armistice is signed.
The South Korean government was actually opposed even to signing an armistice at the end of the war. So the armistice was signed by the US, but not actually by the South Korean government. It's one of the real sticking points to solving the problems on the Korean Peninsula today.
In accordance with the truce agreement, the opposing forces now pulled back from one another. The open ground left between was to become the demilitarized zone, or DMZ. There was excitement, but little rejoicing.
We have stopped the shooting. That means much to the fighting men and their families. And it will allow some of the grievous wounds of Korea to heal. Therefore, I am thankful.
It probably would be a good moment for the United Nations to look back and reflect on their role, on what it did to the global order in the Cold War era. I think the role of the UN in the Korean War just made it much more difficult for the UN to play a really neutral role in the Cold War.
April 1954.
In less than a minute, you will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes.
The atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945 were just the beginning. Since then, the USA has been developing a weapon 1,000 times more powerful.
This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era.
The hydrogen bomb is so terrifying, even the people who worked on it question its use.
The technical implications of the bomb, its colossal destructive power, and its ease of delivery by the new methods of rocket warfare convince me that if ever we are engaged again in a major war, it will mean the obliteration of our island home as an industrial center.
It was a capability that even those of us that helped invent it just couldn't grasp.
The H-bomb could make the horrors of the original atomic bomb look moderate.
The Pacific is the chosen proving ground for the United States H-bomb experiments, here amid vast ocean spaces far from human habitation. The scene is Eniwetok Atoll, a remote chain of coral islands about to take the shattering impact of the colossal detonation. Elutalab Island was the actual site, and around the shed which housed the H-bomb weapon, all sorts of measuring devices were set up. The last few seconds are counted. 3, 2, 1. The shock waves of the world's first H-bomb rushed towards the onlookers, and spellbound they watched something never seen before. Fantastic in its form and in its power, a frantic addition to the arsenal of arms.
The nuclear weapons are very necessary. Unfortunately, they should be very unnecessary, but it's like the genie's out of the bottle.
The hydrogen bomb is the result of fusion, the incredible release of energy when atoms are split and fused together in stages.
Later, a helicopter flew over, and the pilot found that the island had completely disappeared. Nothing there but water and a deep crater. Other islands of the atoll were stripped and scorched, everything on them withered or melted by the blast.
With the H-bomb, the USA regains its position as the only world superpower.
A soldier learns, as a nation must learn, that integrity, backed by strength, is the only sure way to lasting peace.
Zero-hour bikini for the explosion of America's first airborne hydrogen bomb. Lights and radar reflectors define the target area, while the bomber at a height of 9 miles peels off for the drop to be made at 50,000 feet. These pictures, the first to be released, were photographed from 50 miles away.
The Americans are not just winning the arms race. They can instantly wipe the USSR from the map. All of the now 14 NATO countries are protected by the US nuclear umbrella, but the feeling of security is short-lived.
I may say this, members of the Congress, be careful above all things, therefore, not to let go of the atomic weapon until you are sure, and more than sure, that other means of preserving peace are in your hands.
Churchill and Eisenhower do not know the H-bomb secret is already out. The USSR has tested a small hydrogen bomb. 18 months after Eniwetok, the Soviets set off a full-size H-bomb. So big, it triggers detectors in the West.
The largest detonation we ever had of a hydrogen bomb, the Soviets pulled off, I think it was almost 100 megatons. You know, that's 10,000 times more powerful than one of the bombs used in World War II. So the scale of the thing just got out of control.
News reports across the globe are horrified by the effects of the H-bomb if dropped on human populations.
Here's another comparison. The explosion measured about 3¼ miles in diameter. That's how it could strike in New York, the Empire State Building in the center. Any capital city could have its center devastated.
There was almost an expectation that it was inevitable. We just lived every day with an expectation that it was only a matter of time.
A war fought with these weapons is not a winnable war.
But an Italian sculptor who makes cartoons with masks has evidently dreamt up a happy ending to the whole story. Mr. Eisenhower and Mr. Malenkov, he implies, next produced the master weapon, the H-bomb.
It will be a war that would wipe out most life on the planet. By 1955, East and West have reached a stage when a nuclear war might result in mutually assured destruction, M.A.D.
Still, given goodwill on both sides, a solution can be found. In place of H-bomb, doves of peace.
February 1960, a major espionage operation is exposed. A secret American plane flies too low over Soviet airspace. The Soviet Union opens fire.
On display in Moscow, what's alleged to be the wreckage of the U-2 spy plane, which Russia claims to have shot down by rocket. It includes photographs of the suicide needle and other equipment alleged to have been carried by the pilot.
It was a great major technical feat to have the U-2 performing aerial reconnaissance over the Soviet Union.
The plane is a U-2, a high-altitude plane that almost no one knows exists. It was on a mission to take aerial photographs of Soviet military bases.
Our sense was that it was a major mistake. I mean, that was kind of how it was viewed. You know, how could an American pilot have gotten shot down by, the Russians? We must have screwed up somewhere.
The shoot down was a very great victory for the Soviet Union.
The apparent killing of 4 of its crew members and the imprisonment of 2 others on trumped-up spy charges is a shocking affront to the right of all nations.
The maximum sentence for spying is execution. The Cold War becomes very personal.
It's the Hall of Columns in Moscow, scene of many a previous Russian trial. And now, Francis Gary Powers, pilot of the American U-2 spy plane shot down over Russia, faced the judges with composure. He behaved with dignity throughout his ordeal, though his life was possibly at stake.
Being sentenced to death for spying, I think, was, in retrospect, I think was likely. I think the Soviets were, looking to make a statement.
Here is Captain Powers, seen in a home movie film taken some time ago.
Gary's wife and parents were in court for most of the time, a terrible ordeal for them naturally.
The public trial is designed to humiliate the USA.
The plain truth is this. When a nation needs intelligence activity, there is no time when vigilance can be relaxed. It was in the prosecution of one of these intelligence programs that the widely publicized U-2 incident occurred.
The sentence, 10 years.
It was sad, quite frankly, that America had one of their airmen come into harm's way in this fashion. It was also sad for the country, and you could sense this, being embarrassed, politically like that.
Both sides are neck and neck in the arms race that defines the Cold War. The U.S. and USSR rely on friendly countries for security. The North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO, obliges the USA and Western Europe to fight to protect every country in the alliance. As the Cold War becomes restless, NATO becomes more than a treaty.
I believe, first, the preservation of free America requires our participation in the defense of Western Europe.
British airborne forces provided the spearhead of the attack in Operation Brown Jug, the biggest exercise yet carried out in Denmark by combined NATO forces.
U.S. military units are moved to the front line, the border between Western and Eastern Europe. They learn to work as a team with the Europeans in regular NATO maneuvers.
Off the southern shores of Sardinia, British, Italian and American forces take part in a combined assault exercise. This particular phase involved Royal Marines and US Marines, and quite a tough business too. What a way to come ashore. Now the Admiral tries it. No comment.
It was a good deal if you work with NATO, because NATO headquarters celebrated all NATO holidays and all U.S. holidays. But it seemed like they were always on vacation. I'm joking, of course.
NATO bases in Western Europe are supplied with American bombs. The possibility of a nuclear strike is real.
Okay, yes, I was stationed at Royal Air Force Wildenrad, which was a well-equipped station built after World War II, specifically for NATO. There was a top-secret room which had all the maps available of targets we might be required to hit. I flew an aircraft called the Canberra BI-8. The aircraft, first of all, were wired for nuclear weapons, and we didn't have them. Each crew was allocated a target. The plan was to fly as high as possible for the first bit, and on reaching the edge of the Soviet radar at about 450 knots, and at a pre-calculated point, we'd pull up into a 3G half loop, and at 45 degrees, release the weapon, which again is done automatically. The aircraft would continue on a half loop to about 30 degrees below the horizon, upside down, and then turn the right way up, dive as fast as possible to the ground, and try and beat the fireball back to safety. We had no illusions there'd probably not be any coming back, because the Soviets would not sit there and wait for us to bomb their airfields. They would do the same to us. And we felt that if the worst came to the worst, we would do our job.
By the mid-1950s, U.S. armed forces are stationed in bases from the UK to France, Belgium, and Germany. All are on 24-hour standby to protect the West from a Soviet invasion.
We had nuclear weapons pre-positioned in Europe, and that was common knowledge. They were there to be used if it became necessary. Even down when I was commissioned as a lieutenant, and in my battalion, which is about 800 people, we had the Davy Crockett, which was a tactical nuclear weapon. Well, it's just a prudent thing and the responsible thing to do. You prepare for the worst and hope for the best.
As the fear of global annihilation grows, so does the scale and range of the planes designed to drop the bomb.
The Americans are also considering expanding aviation production with priority for long-range bombers. Work on the Boeing Stratofortress B-52 is in full swing.
The B-52 is huge. Powered by 8 jet engines, it can carry 35 tons of weaponry.
Taking off from California, 3 nuclear B-52 jet bombers begin their non-stop flight around the world. The giant planes have their tanks replenished several times while in the air. They've got a range of 6,000 miles without refueling. With 24 jet engines roaring in unison, the 3 planes are averaging over 500 miles an hour. 24,325 miles in a non-stop time of 45 hours and 19 minutes. A world record.
Eisenhower steps up U.S. spending on defense to $24.2 billion.
The B-52 should make any aggressor think twice before making trouble.
October 1956. The standoff between East and West is about to be put to the test. 8 Eastern European countries are under Soviet domination. One of those countries has had enough.
I had no idea, no inkling of the fact that this was going to happen.
Hungary decides to take a stand.
The Hungarians began heroic bid for freedom with a fight for life against Red oppression.
The security police shot into the crowd and killed somebody. Up until then, it was a peaceful demonstration. But when that happened, it became a violent revolution.
Scenes filmed during the Battle of Budapest show patriots fighting street by street in a desperate effort to win back their liberty at last. All along the battle-torn avenues, derelict tanks bore witness to the fury of the battle. Some 8,000 people are believed to have lost their lives in the face of Soviet tanks and artillery.
The Hungarians take revenge on their oppressors.
In the bitter conflict, the secret police were routed and their headquarters ransacked. Communist books and leaflets were burnt in the streets as a triumphant gesture by those who had suffered an iron-shod oppression.
At the end of a 6-day fight that astonished the world and shook the Kremlin to its foundations, Hungary was free.
The Hungarian uprising is a moment of optimism in a world in fear of Russian domination.
The Hungarian Revolution that was widely described in the Soviet press, and it was portrayed, of course, as this attempt to subvert the socialist life.
It seems as though the underdogs have won. A nation of 10 million people has broken free from its massive neighbor in the east. But the party is short, and the fight for freedom is not over.
Then word came that Russian forces were massing and all communication with the West was cut off.
And what happened when the Soviet tanks were sent in? They surrounded the city and they gave an ultimatum to the revolutionaries to surrender. All these hundreds, maybe thousands of tanks which encircled the city were parked outside our apartment block. But the revolutionaries refused to surrender, so they went in and crushed it.
Rumors flared of the re-entry of Russian forces and new fighting. The beautiful city of Budapest, scarred by conflict, again faces a Russian onslaught, even before the debris of the fight for freedom is cleared from the streets.
Now to Vienna, where the broadcast from Budapest was picked up and recorded during the confused situation in Hungary. A voice giving the news, followed by the sound of fighting.
Many Hungarians are convinced Western nations will join their fight against the Russians.
Well, they were very hopeful about intervention by the West and particularly the United States. I mean, we listened to a radio station called Free Europe, which was broadcast out of Germany, and it was financed by the CIA. So that was a propaganda station. And my parents and I, we listened to that all the time, and they were urging us, egging the Hungarians on to fight and to resist, and we will come and help you. But they never did.
This time, the Russians are uncompromising. the only help offered by the West is through the Red Cross.
Casualties, as everyone knows, have been heavy, and many countries, including Britain, are sending help for the wounded.
Protests erupt around the globe. On the streets of New York, in front of the United Nations. No military aid is offered despite emphatic speeches at NATO.
In retrospect, I understand why. I mean, you know, the reality was that the Americans didn't want to risk a nuclear war by going to war with the Soviet Union.
And the events of recent weeks in Hungary have shown conclusively that the Soviet Union will not hesitate to use force to suppress human freedom.
My father was active during the events, and there would have been retribution had we stayed after the revolution. That must have been the moment when my parents decided that it's time to flee.
The only hope for many is to get out as quickly as possible. In the panic, homes are abandoned and families become separated.
Leaving their parents, these two little boys reached the Austrian border, alone and half-starved.
My mother woke us up, the three kids, and said, "Get dressed, we're going." I said, "Well, going where? It's 3 o'clock in the morning, where are we going?" And she said, "Never mind that, just get dressed." So we got dressed, left everything, and then we got on a train heading down to the Austrian border.
The flight to Austria and freedom becomes a steady flow.
The refugees had to dodge Russian troops who were patrolling the canal. In the tall reeds of the marshland, the Hungarians hide until it seems to be all clear. And then, in little exhausted groups, they stumble across. Sometimes friendly Austrian frontier guards are on the lookout to guide the Hungarians to the best crossing place.
The Hungarian people who helped refugees to safety were shot if caught.
That night, Julius took us across the border, and he held my hand and my little brother's hand, and following us were my older brother and my parents, and he took us across this field of corn. We walked very quietly, nobody spoke. The only noise that I could hear or remember was the squeaky noise of the shoes in the light snow.
And as the Russians close in, attempts to escape get more desperate.
And even after the Russians smashed up the bridge, refugees continued to get across, clambering over the wreckage. They form a human chain to carry a baby to safety.
The Hungarian people are once more prisoners in their own country.
As night descends on liberty behind the Iron Curtain, a ring of red tanks blocks the last road to safety.
As communist ideology tightens its grip in Europe, it's about to strike a killer blow across the Atlantic.
In the new city of Havana, you see evidence of an ingenious talent in architecture.
Cuba's capital is booming, with lavish bars, casinos, and beach clubs.
They've given the tropics a new tempo, a blood-stirring Latin rhythm which sets the feet to dancing and the heart to pounding.
Havana in the 50s was one of the great party cities of the Americas, and it was a very lively and very wealthy city as well. It attracted tourists, not just from the US, but right around the world.
By the 1950s, Havana is earning more revenue than Las Vegas. Movie stars, models, and millionaires come to play. But there is a dark secret.
The Batista regime was corrupt. To some extent, it wasn't all that different to what was going on in many other places in Latin America.
Bags of cash are collected from the casinos and clubs every night. And not everyone in Cuba benefits from the sparkling city.
Here is the real backbone of the country, the great seas of flowing sugarcane, still harvested by machetes and loaded by hand on primitive ox carts.
It's hard, back-breaking work that is mechanized in most other countries, but not in Cuba. A lot of peasants in Cuba who were sugarcane cutters had a very tough time because sugar gets cut in a very small period of time, a few months. They would get work during that time, the rest of the time they wouldn't. So that was very, very difficult, clearly.
The refinery plays an almost human role in Cuban life and is usually named after dear ones. Sounds funny, but you might know this industrial layout as Dolores.
In the 1950s, the bulk of the sugar was sold to the US. There was a special agreement between Cuba and the US, which meant that the US paid a fixed price.
Sugar is Cuba's white gold, but much of the profits flow into US multinationals or the pockets of President Batista.
President for the first time in 1940, Batista regained the presidency in 1952.
Batista uses torture and execution to silence opposition. Cuba is a police state.
You had a very comfortable middle class that was continuing to grow and that wanted political change.
November 1956. The heat in the Cold War is about to be turned up. A yacht named the Granma approaches the Cuban coast. An army of revolutionaries is on board. Their leader, a young lawyer, Fidel Castro.
A revolution that began with Castro, a fugitive, practically alone, landing with 82 followers, to be nearly wiped out by government forces.
The Cuban Revolution nearly ends before it's begun. Castro and what remains of his rebels managed to hide in the mountains.
Like most other Cuban families, my family was supportive of what Castro said he was trying to do at first.
The rebel numbers increase. They strike out when they can.
The forces of Castro's 26th of July movement have grown vastly, their power enlarged by captured and surrendered army weapons.
World champion Juan Fangio was tipped as the winner, they said, but that was before he was kidnapped from his Havana hotel. His team members tell the police how Fangio was carried off at gunpoint by Cuban rebels who wanted to sabotage the race. He was only released after it was over.
Over the next 18 months, Castro's forces gather both strength and support.
A lot of the people who supported the revolution and who went up to the mountains to fight were middle-class, politically aware young men and women. Peasants from those areas did join later on, but the nub of the revolution was very middle-class.
Then the rebel armies break out of the Sierra Maestra. Total revolution flares up.
Castro met an all-out government offensive with a counterattack, and in the battle for the key rail center of Santa Clara, won the crucial victory.
January 1st, 1959. President Batista flees Cuba. He takes a personal fortune of $300 million.
Nearly 2 years of hit-and-run warfare aimed at toppling Batista's government by paralyzing Cuba's economy culminated in victory as 1958 ended.
The Batista government has murdered 20,000 people in the last 7 years.
Havana goes wild as the news spreads that Cuba's long struggle has ended with the flight of Batista and the triumph of Fidel Castro.
At first, the celebration was peaceful as shouting, cheering crowds surged through the city. Then the temper of the throng changed and an ugly mob ranged the streets. Its prime targets the symbols of the overthrown regime: the gambling casinos, the parking meters, the homes and businesses of Batista's cronies.
The news is good. Castro is on his way to Havana and his troops will soon be here, so hurry. Now is the moment to celebrate and to get a bit of our own back. Anyone suspected of sympathy for the Batista regime came in for a rough time.
Castro brings his troops 850 kilometers from Santiago de Cuba to Havana.
They had marched right across the island in a triumphant progress, joyfully acclaimed all the way.
In January '59, when Castro rides from one end of the island all the way to Havana, there was enormous popular support for what had happened, and my parents were no different.
At last, Dr. Fidel Castro himself arrived. Time and again, he was held up by the crowds.
Within 5 weeks, Castro is sworn in as the Prime Minister of Cuba.
He spoke to them of the new regime now being inaugurated, a regime, by the way, now formally recognized by Britain.
Castro makes an impact on Cuba almost immediately. He spends money on healthcare, clean water, education, and housing.
Showing another aspect of his character, the unpredictable Castro dons a baseball uniform to pitch a full inning in a benefit game for his agrarian land reform fund.
But not everyone is happy. Hundreds of enemies are tried and executed.
Castro initially made overtures to the US and went to the US very early in '59 and declared he was not a communist, he was a Democrat, and elections would be held in Cuba. In fact, he even gave a timeline of 18 months. Well, the 18 months came and went and nothing much happened.
Land is taken from private owners and given to farm workers. The sugar industry is nationalized, and the multinational companies lose their cash cow. Cuba is clearly a communist state. It is less than 200 kilometers from the USA. Relations between the two nations plummet.
He achieved virtually the impossible. He established a communist satellite right on the doorstep of the United States. Since then, Castro has held the respect and adoration of his people, along with the fear and loathing of the Western powers, particularly the United States. Once in power, Castro visited the United States and was recognized as his country's head of government. The US knew Castro was plotting its downfall, and in its turn, the United States was busy plotting his death or overthrow.
And I'm not a complete believer in kind of American or Western innocence in every case. I think in Cuba, for example, you know, there was legitimate rejection of the old regime.
President Eisenhower commands the CIA to assassinate Castro. He gives them $13 million to do the job.
Fidel Castro whips up a furor in Cuba, charging the United States with arming and training mercenary forces for an imminent invasion.
Tensions between the Cold War next-door neighbors builds to breakpoint.
She's the French freighter La Couble, which blew up in Havana while unloading munitions. There was heavy loss of life, and when more explosions followed, the fire spread to warehouses along the dock. The actual scene of the blaze was ugly enough. But Dr. Castro, the Cuban Prime Minister, added fuel to the political flames by saying that sabotage caused the disaster. His implication that United States officials were responsible brought an immediate and rigorous denial and protest. These accusations shocked America almost as violently as the exploding ship rocked Havana. Such fires are not easily put out.
Then, 1,400 troops make a secret landing on a beach in southern Cuba. They are Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. They are here to overthrow Castro. The invaders are defeated within 4 days.
And confusion among the relatives of the insurgents. In Miami, they besieged the headquarters of the Revolutionary Democratic Front, seeking some news of sons and brothers, with Castro claiming the capture of 500 invaders and threatening them all with the firing squad. These weeping women see no chance for their loved ones.
Some of the insurgents are executed. Most are returned to the USA in exchange for food and medicine in the value of $53 million. The invasion is named after the landing spot chosen by the US trained troops, the Bay of Pigs.
The notorious Bay of Pigs invasion by exiled Cubans served only to humiliate Cuba's giant northern neighbor.
The USA can't seem to win a trick. For the West, the Bay of Pigs invasion is an all-time low in the Cold War. But within a year, events in Cuba will be infinitely more chilling. It is the night of the 4th of October, 1957.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket. A three-stage rocket. Number one, the booster in the class of an intercontinental missile. Its weight estimated at 50 tons. The smaller second stage took over at 5,000 miles an hour and carried on to the highest point reached. 500 miles up, the artificial moon is boosted to a speed counterbalancing the pull of gravity and released. You are hearing the actual signals transmitted by the Earth-circling satellite, one of the great scientific feats of the age.
I was a young boy with Dad in Oklahoma when Sputnik was launched. And I remember looking up, and he pointed it out as it would go by in the sky. It was just awesome. It was mind-boggling to think that it was possible to place a human object in outer space. And it was a little bit scary, you know, the fact that you could place something in orbit and it wasn't us. It got people's attention.
Sputnik, the world's first man-made object in space. The signal from this little shiny ball can be heard by anyone with a radio receiver. It strikes dread into the hearts of the West.
Then round and round the globe at 18,000 miles an hour, bleep bleeping to Moscow and the world. Apparent proof that Russia could deliver an H-bomb at long range by rocket.
The West was clearly very concerned about Sputnik. And this is a case where, you know, the popular movies are under-dramatizing what was really going on. You had a major strategic event that had massive implications for national defense, national security, economic advantage.
Стимулом сильнейшим для появления у нас первого спутника и причиной того, что мы оказались впереди американцев, была в том числе и атмосфера холодной войны.
President Eisenhower needs to rally the confidence of his country.
It is my conviction, supported by trusted scientific and military advisors, that although the Soviets are quite likely ahead in some missile and special areas, and are obviously ahead of us in satellite development, as of today, the overall military strength of the free world is distinctly greater than that of the communist countries. We must see to it that whatever advantages they have are temporary only.
The U.S. satellite will be launched by a Vanguard rocket. The reputation of a nation is at stake.
A moment or two of high expectation after the firing button has been pressed. Is that a fuel leak there in the first section of the three-stage rocket? Disaster follows, as this official film shows only too clearly.
Six weeks later, the USA is ready to try again.
At Cape Canaveral, Florida, the Army's Jupiter C rocket is ready for America's second attempt to launch a space satellite. The moment is at hand, the countdown reaches 0. Some 3 minutes later, Explorer is in orbit.
The space race between East and West is on. But no one is under any illusion that the fight to conquer space is about benevolent exploration.
There is absolutely no question that the massive effort was being put in the development of strategic missiles and the weapon systems on those strategic missiles.
This year's parade in Moscow's Red Square was extra special, for it marked the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution. And then came the evidence that we're now living in the rocket age. Modern weapons like this tell the story of Russia's striking power. Of all scientific advances achieved in the past year, rockets have made the greatest impact on the mind of man. Armed as these missiles can be with nuclear warheads, they point skywards with terrifying implications. 1957, the year of the rocket, has indeed brought the theory of devastating push-button warfare very close to fact.
The awe and wonderment of the systems, mind-boggling. You know, I remember as a kid, Dad would take us to, probably shouldn't have, but we went on to SAC bases, and I went over B-52s. We went to see missile firings in strange locations. You know, you look down at ballistic missile silo, hundreds of feet in the ground, and as a kid, I mean, awesome capabilities that are cause you to dream and be excited about where technology is going. But then you realize their purpose is destruction, and not destruction on a manageable scale, but mass destruction.
Both sides strive to be bigger and better in this new theater of war.
With a weight of 8,800 pounds, the Atlas is by far the biggest satellite, more than double the mass of Russia's Sputnik 3. Soviet Russia scores a dramatic victory in the exploration of space with the launching of the first rocket to hit.
This time at Cape Canaveral, a naval vanguard did the job perfectly, to circle the globe at 19,000 miles an hour and join the others, getting quite crowded up there.
As the space race accelerates, both sides take aim for the ultimate prize: to place a human being into orbit and bring him home.
the B-52 mother plane carries aloft the X-15 rocket plane leading up to the epic mission for which it was designed. To carry a man beyond the fringes of the Earth's atmosphere and to return him to the ground. The X-15 is cut loose 7 miles over the Mojave Desert to fall free and glide back to Earth. The space plane's first free flight is a success.
News on developments are broadcast by both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Also seen in Moscow, the press conference given by the space dogs. Strelka, Little Arrow, and Bielka, Squirrel, the white one, seem to be in excellent form. In fact, by their cheerful demeanor, they answered all questions about how they'd stood the journey. Having whizzed round the Earth 17 times, we're told, at a height of 200 miles, they were safely back with quite a story to tell, if only they could tell it. Russian scientists claim that these dogs have blazed the trail for cosmic flight by man.
When the day finally comes, the world is changed forever.
The Earth looked a delicate blue floating in a black sky. So said the first man in space after his fabulous journey of 108 minutes, Major Yuri Gagarin.
The Gagarin trip into space was a tremendous kind of celebration. The Soviets were sure that we were the most advanced nation on Earth, but that confirmed it. Gagarin, of course, was this photogenic guy, really nice guy, actually. He was really a true national hero.
With a smile that could light up the Cold War, Yuri Gagarin becomes the darling of both East and West.
Major Gagarin looked as pleased to arrive in Britain as Britain was to greet him.
And one of the great demonstrations that a capability had reached maturity was the ability to launch a human in space.
The Soviet Union is well and truly ahead in space technology. It will take 8 more years and a new president before the USA bounces back. August 1961, one Eastern Bloc country faces a crisis. Despite the Iron Curtain, East Germany has been hemorrhaging people.
The flow of those seeking asylum here on the fringe of freedom has reached 1,500 a day.
$3.5 million East Germans have fled across the inner German border, 20% of the population.
And the Soviets saw all the intelligentsia and the professionals, the doctors, the lawyers, the builders, the architects, migrating to the West.
The hole in the border between East and West is in one city, Berlin.
The attention of an anxious world is focused on East and West Germany and Berlin. The last great exodus of refugees from the East is processed in the Marienfelde Center. Once the East Germans are processed, they are absorbed into the hungry West German labor market.
Midnight, Saturday, the 4th of August, 1961. Khrushchev decides to plug the leak.
East German troops swoop down on the border between Red Berlin and the Free City in the pre-dawn hours to close the 66 points where movement between the sectors has been relatively free.
It was not trying to keep people out. It was trying to keep people from escaping. They were losing 250,000 people a week, and that was the power drain on them.
Barbed wire is rolled out across the city. By Sunday morning, Berlin has been cut in half. The border between East and West Berlin is closed. Houses in the east are demolished to create an open space along the fence.
Berliners who held coveted jobs in the West were told to stay home, and the elevated trains were halted. But from now on, crossings into free Berlin will be fugitive affairs.
It was very dangerous to escape from East Germany into the West. But people came up with ingenious methods of escaping. Inside of car fenders, people would rappel from buildings.
East Berliners who have apartments facing the border take the long chance when they get orders to leave their homes for the interior. While an East German guard attempts to yank her back to prison, West Berliners pull her to a fire net and freedom.
Friends of an East Berliner raise a ladder from the west over the cemetery wall, over the barbed wire. Then the signal, and the fugitive makes his daring dash up the tilted ladder. He must feel that 1,000 enemy eyes are on him, 100 guns pointed at his back. His friends watch and pray. Seconds seem like hours. He's over. One more man has slipped the red yoke. He's a 25-year-old mathematician from Cottbus who has a fiancée in West Germany, proving again that love laughs at locksmiths and border guards.
The guards were East German guards. They weren't Soviet guards because the Soviets were trying to save a bit of cash. And they were more vicious than the Soviets.
The East German border guards have orders to shoot to kill.
The frontier is heavily guarded now, and escape is more difficult. Yet still they vote for freedom, and they call it voting with their feet, like this. Looks as if she's hurt herself, but no, she's all right. Over the frontier, the prison walls behind.
When I moved to Berlin, I was a major in command of a special forces unit that didn't exist. It didn't really matter whether they're communist or not, but it's a totalitarian regime, and they didn't want you to leave.
In key areas, the fence is quickly replaced by a wall.
Once they'd revealed their intention last year, the East German authorities worked feverishly night and day to complete it. Solid and apparently impregnable, concrete blocks 10 and 12 feet high, reinforced by tank traps. It stretches for 26 miles right across the city. In some places, the front of a house or block of flats is in the western sector, while the back is part of the east.
The Berlin Wall is complete. Friends, families, and half a city are permanently cut off. The wall becomes a focus of conflict on the Cold War front line.
For a year, the unending war of nerves has gone on. Smoke bombs and water jets from mobile water tanks have greeted those in the West who dared to come too close.
The challenge we had in Berlin throughout the years was that we were surrounded by enemy, and we were deep within enemy lines. We even introduced 155 howitzer artillery in Berlin, which is a nuclear-capable weapon. Surprisingly, there was not a lot of objection to that.
If there is a dangerous crisis in Berlin, and there is, it is because of threats against the vital interests and the deep commitments of the Western powers and the freedom of West Berlin.
And it became more difficult as time went on because the wall was not static. It was constantly improved on. Every time somebody escaped, there was an effort made to identify what the weak links were, and then measures were taken to correct it and to fortify that wall.
Against all odds, the East Germans are not beaten.
This is just one of many tunnels honeycombing the border between the east and western sectors. At least 17 escapers have used this route to freedom, but hundreds have got away through similar tunnels.
Horrific stories emerge as the wall stands guard. One of the most chilling concerns a 20-year-old bricklayer.
The anger of the people of West Berlin has been provoked by recent actions of the communists. In particular, their cold-blooded attitude towards an East Berlin youth shot as he tried to escape across the wall.
There's a river, Spree, which divides east and west as well, which is in the Soviet side of the wall. People tried to swim the Spree, but there were guard towers there, and they physically shot people dead swimming in the river. Peter Fechter, who was a young student who managed to swim the Spree, was climbing over the barbed wire fence on the other side, got stuck on the fence, and they just shot him dead.
Peter Fechter lies alone at the foot of the wall for over an hour before dying from his injuries.
And he's left his body there for about 3 days. There's a little cemetery with crosses of all the people who were shot by East German guards trying to make a bid for freedom.
The Cold War in Berlin is very personal. Germans escaping from Germany, families forced apart, border guards shooting their own countrymen. The tensions in Berlin could easily escalate. The President of the USA comes to make a stand.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Despite continuing atrocities, the wall shows every sign of being a permanent feature in Berlin.
The first obvious result of the building of new walls is to increase the tension. Here in Berlin, the West stands on guard facing the next move by the East in the continuing Cold War.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, so help me God.
January 1961. Jack Kennedy is the youngest man to become president of the United States. He has a fresh approach to the tension between East and West.
We offer not a pledge, but a request that both sides begin anew the quest for peace. Before the dark powers of destruction engulf all humanity in planned or accidental self-destruction.
In Vienna, Kennedy organizes a private meeting with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev.
Разрешите, господин федеральный президент, поблагодарить вас за теплую встречу, за добрые слова в адрес Советского Союза, нашего народа.
90 miles from Florida, Castro's Cuba finally provoked the United States to quarantine the island. Aerial films revealed the presence on Cuban soil of offensive Russian nuclear weapons.
Here you had a Soviet outpost with nuclear missiles 90 miles from the US.
The Cold War comes to America's backyard.
I was born in Banes, which is a small sugar town on the eastern edge of Cuba. When the Americans went to the UN with proof of the missiles, many of those photographs were of areas near Banes.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
It was a reckless gamble to which President Kennedy reacted swiftly. He ordered the fleet to turn back or seize ships attempting to augment this aggressive buildup.
Many of the missiles were supposedly driven under cover and so on, but these are huge bloody things, so clearly everyone knew that something was going on.
The Cuban Missile Crisis, the most chilling episode so far of the Cold War.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
And I clearly remember standing at the beach with my parents, and you could see in the distance, in the horizon, grey ships that were American battle cruisers. That's how close it came.
At every air base in the United States, planes of every type are ready to retaliate against any aggression.
Despite Kennedy's warning, Russian Premier Khrushchev continues to ship missiles across the Atlantic with the full support of Cuba's leader.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace, and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. He has an opportunity now to move the world back from the abyss of destruction.
No one knows at the time, but just off the coast, a heated argument kicks off. 3 Soviet submariners have to make a terrible decision.
A US destroyer dropped a depth charge in the vicinity of a Russian submarine. It knocked out the communications of that submarine with Moscow. The protocol that applied at the time for the Russian commander was to use the nuclear-tipped weapon he had on board, the assumption being that if he'd been hurt by enemy action, there must be a war on. So he had the hard decision to make as to what to actually do.
The captain's name is Savitsky. Soviet nuclear protocol dictates 3 senior officers must vote unanimously to launch the nuclear missile. The second in command votes against his captain.
And by a 2-to-1 vote, World War III, I guess, was averted.
The story of a man who saved the world is not revealed until 1998. His name was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. An emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council is called.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing missiles and sites in Cuba? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no.
But diplomacy is quickly overridden by secrecy and frustration.
You have denied that they exist. I want to know if I've understood you correctly. Prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
As talks break down, nuclear war looks imminent.
Command center was there at Redstone. In those days, there was a bunker in southern Appalachians. Dad went away for 2 or 3 weeks. He said, we had the codes and we were waiting for the order to fire, and there was not a single one of us that weren't convinced that this was going to happen. Since we were literally within minutes of pushing the button. He said, all I could think about is you and your sister and your mother were going to be vapor. We all came to grips that it was truly the end of the world as we knew it. And it was maybe 20 years later before he would even talk about it.
Khrushchev refuses to budge. His missiles are in Cuba in response to a threat from the USA. American nuclear warheads are in Turkey, right next to the Soviet border.
Issue which confronts the Security Council is grave. The hopes of mankind are concentrated in this room.
Frantic talk between both sides continues. Protests seethe on the streets of the West. The outcome is finally determined by one-on-one talks between Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy.
There is historical evidence of Castro writing to Moscow and urging them to fire the missiles and in effect starting a nuclear war. He's bonkers. I'm telling you, he's absolutely bonkers.
And the deal which Khrushchev wanted to make, if he was to agree not to put missiles to Cuba, was for the Americans to move their missiles from Turkey. It was not in the Americans' interest to embarrass the Soviets too much.
Kennedy reacted correctly to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had he not addressed it the way he addressed it, quite frankly, against a lot of the military and civil leadership, we may well have had the first nuclear war. And the first nuclear war may well have been the last one, because once it starts, don't know that you can contain it.
The retreat to Moscow. Russian ships steam out from Cuban ports with their decks loaded with missiles the Soviets are withdrawing under pressure from the New World.
The story put out in the press is that Khrushchev has capitulated.
U.S. planes and picket ships have counted 42 rockets on Russian-bound ships.
Kennedy has given some ground too. U.S. missiles are quietly removed from Turkish soil.
They finally cut a deal that, you get the nuclear weapons out of Cuba and quit trying to expand communism in the Western Hemisphere, then we'll take our intermediate range nuclear weapons out of Turkey and we'll all get along for at least for a while.
Both sides save face. History's most dangerous game of poker is over.
This year we were saluting not only the glorious dead of 2 world wars, but giving thanks that the world had drawn back from the brink of disaster over Cuba.
In a small country almost no one has heard of, civil war breaks out. It is about 4,800 miles away from Moscow and almost 9,000 miles from Washington, D.C.
America began her aid program, bringing equipment, weapons, and experience to bolster the South. The Russians and the Chinese gave their support to the North.
Vietnam, August 1964. The people here have already been fighting for 20 years. First, against the Japanese occupation, then against French colonial rule, now against each other.
This year, the Viet Cong struck in larger groups than ever before. When government forces flushed a large communist group, the guerrillas drifted into the jungle to regroup.
I was born in the North, before Vietnam was divided into 2 parts. My parents took us south because they witnessed the cruelty and atrocities. And I grew up in the South. Went to school, medical school, graduated, joined the army.
The communist Viet Cong are close to winning the war.
They have made hit-and-run raids within 4 miles of Saigon, center of U.S. and South Vietnam operations.
Both sides were poor countries, no weapon production. So both sides relied heavily on their allies. The South, the American mostly, and the North communist, Red China, and the Soviet Union at the time.
American troops are not directly involved in the fighting, but American warships hover off the coast.
We do not want Southeast Asia to fall under communist domination.
If South Vietnam succumbs to the North, America thought it may have a domino effect, the first country to fall in a communist expansion across Asia and beyond. Then, a tiny incident in the South China Sea lights a flame.
Reports have been received of a nighttime incident in the Gulf of Tonkin.
We had these boats that we detected on radar, and then we picked them up visually. They're approaching from our starboard quarter. We opened fire. They launched their torpedoes.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident is billed as the first direct attack by the North Vietnamese on the U.S. military. A U.S. aircraft carrier is not far from the Maddox. Robert McNamara, U.S. Secretary of Defense, briefs the press.
They were reporting they were avoiding torpedoes and that they had sunk one of the attacking patrol craft.
No pictures of the attack are released, and the U.S. warships are undamaged.
In view of the unprovoked attacks, the deliberate attacks in international waters on U.S. naval forces, the United States has taken the precaution of moving substantial military reinforcements to Southeast Asia.
Questions hang in the air about the Gulf of Tonkin attack. But the USA finally has a reason to turn its might on the North Vietnamese.
At sea, on land, and in the air, the awesome United States military machine is mounting a force that can face up to any threat.
The USA is now in the front line of the Vietnam War.
From its 4.5-acre flight deck, the American carrier Enterprise can unleash more destructive power than the combined airstrikes of World War II.
When they decided to send troops to Vietnam, it was a very, very bad move because that kind of gave the communists a good, just reason, because there are foreigners there in South Vietnam. Once the war started, and the weapon kept on rolling in by both sides.
We are in Southeast Asia to help our friends preserve their own opportunity to be free of imported terror, of alien assassination managed by the North Vietnam communists.
American troops wait to advance on Viet Cong positions while Sky Raiders prepare the way with their terrifying napalm bombs. This is the hot spot in the Cold War, and this year saw it getting hotter.
Whereas the Americans, because they rely so heavily on their superior firepower, they'll go into battle in the jungle like going into a big picnic. Made a lot of noises. The enemy can smell their aftershave and their silent cigarette miles away and avoid clashes.
American casualties quickly rise.
This sergeant was later to die from his wounds because medical helicopters couldn't get through. The Americans can no longer afford to underestimate the power and skill of the Viet Cong. The cost of this conflict is a nightmare balance sheet in lives and money. It's costing America at least $1,000 million every month. At least 170,000 Viet Cong have been killed and nearly 7,000 Americans.
President Johnson is called to account.
Find an answer to their problem there. I believe last week they had the second largest week of casualties that the enemy has ever suffered out there.
Their wounded are in excess of, their dead body counts in excess of 10,000. Their wounded is something we estimate more than 3 times that much, and they lose most of their wounded, and we lose less than 1% of ours.
But the greatest death rate is among ordinary farmers and villagers.
Meanwhile, Vietnamese civilians walk hopelessly away from their burning homes. Innocent victims of a dispute too complex for many of them to understand.
And of course, I witnessed the tragedy and the waste of war as well. And you don't wish it on anybody. During the war, collateral damages is always there. You can't avoid hurting civilians. The peasants, the farmers, they are victims of the war. Because they have nowhere to hide, nowhere to run.
The people of North Vietnam are now fiercely anti-American. They are enlisted to help the Viet Cong.
As well as rice, the peasants plant a less palatable crop. The American troops would be impaled on those sharp bamboos in trying to avoid the dummy Viet Cong. Schooling, says the commentator, has to be confined to the night time to avoid the air raids by day. It's hard for the children, the Russian commentary continues, but the day will come when their country will be free and happy.
Future President Richard Nixon does not believe the determination of the North Vietnamese is a serious threat.
We should assume that the war could last 2, 3, or 4 years. Hoping, of course, that by applying more power, we could reduce that below 2 years.
Then American confidence is blown away. The New Year festival of Tet is the biggest holiday in Vietnam, celebrated with flowers and food.
The Tet, which is Vietnamese New Year's, very, very sacred occasion in the Vietnamese culture. So there was a ceasefire agreed on by both sides, but they deliberately violated that.
But in 1968, the Tet holiday is anything but peaceful.
A bloody battle rages in the center of Saigon. The Viet Cong offensive throughout South Vietnam struck at the very heart of the Allied command. It also brought home to all Americans the suicidal determination of their opponents, their ability to infiltrate and conduct a devastating guerrilla campaign.
I was brought down to Saigon to be the deputy commanding officer of the American Forces Radio and TV Network. Was my day job. My night job was special operations, clandestine work. I thought the North Vietnamese were very disciplined, very hardcore, willing to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their youth to the idea of reunifying Vietnam. The South Vietnamese were very lovely people. They were very hard fighters once they were trained and given the proper weapons, and very much wanting to be their own country and not dominated by China.
80,000 North Vietnamese troops strike all over the South. But Tet proves a severe blow to the North's hopes. Over 45,000 soldiers are killed. However, it shows that America is not winning. It is a great political victory for the North.
Once again, the plight of the civilian is heartrending. But sympathy is tempered by suspicion. Many thousands of so-called refugees have been arrested on grounds of assisting the communist cause. The death toll of this fearful week of fighting is to been killed. Allied military losses number nearly 1,500.
The USA wakes up to the fact that Vietnam is not going to be an easy war to win. January 1968. One country in Eastern Europe is about to push back against the restrictions behind the Iron Curtain.
I was a little kid. I lived in Prague suburbs, and I was from a typical family. It was very commanded, very state-controlled, and was centrally planned economy. We had a duty to work. If you didn't work for more than 3 months, you could go to prison for being a parasite of the society. My parents were not communists.
Czechoslovakia has a new party leader with new ideas. Alexander Dubček has challenged hardline communism and won. He puts his reforms into action: a freer market, freedom of movement, and steps towards a multi-party government.
For the people of Prague, it must have felt like being the nut in a nutcracker. To the west, East Germany; to the north, Poland; to the east, Russia herself. A pencil grip of traditional Soviet communism which could shatter all hopes of a more enlightened socialism.
The Russians are not happy. Dubček is summoned to the Politburo in Moscow.
There is going to be this head-on tussle in the Politburo meeting with Mr. Dubček. Is it possible that one outcome of it could be Mr. Dubček's resignation, do you think?
Mr. Dubček is a very sincere and honest man. If he promises something, he keeps his word.
The hopes of the Czech people rest on Dubček's shoulders. He calls his program socialism with a human face. The West call it the Prague Spring. But the Russian noose is already tightening. Huge armies gather on the Czech border.
K té ozbrojené akci může dojít. Nakonec se jednalo o největší vojenskou akci v Evropě po druhé světové válce, takže ty pohyby vojsk byly masivní a samozřejmě Sověti nemohli uhlídat, bych řekl, přípravu tak obrovské operace.
The reform that causes the greatest friction is freedom of the press.
In Vienna, behind a complete security screen, the Russians had restated their demands that the reforming element in the Czech cabinet should be forcibly removed, that censorship of the press should be restored.
But just supposing the Russian pressure from the Politburo is so great that Mr. Dubček does give in and say to them, okay, we will have censorship back. What then would be the reaction of Czech journalists?
Now, after more than 7 months of free press, they wouldn't like to go back to the old times where when they weren't able to express their own views.
Europe holds its breath, aware of lessons from recent history.
It was this same intransigent attitude which caused the Hungarians to revolt in 1956.
No one wants the bloodshed in Hungary repeated in Czechoslovakia.
Millions of people throughout the communist bloc are desperately trying to persuade the Soviets that it is possible to live by democratic principles and be a good communist as well.
The Prague Spring lasts 8 months.
Suddenly we saw tanks at the end of the street, and we were very excited about it, shouting tanks, tanks, and we were running our tricycles close to the tanks.
Z paměti mě určitě už nevyšumí vzpomínka, kdy nás maminka vlastně na 20. srpna ještě za tmy budila se slovy, že začala 3. světová válka. S pláčem, slzy v očích a tím na nás budila.
Overnight, 2,000 tanks and 200,000 troops invade.
Russian, Polish and Hungarian troops carry out their cold-blooded occupation of Czechoslovakia. With repeated appeals for calm from the Czech authorities, The mood of the people was grim and hostile.
My father took the numbers from the building, identification numbers, like which is red and blue. People are supposed to take down the numbers, the names of the streets and numbers to confuse the occupants.
Demonstrators carried a flag stained by the blood of a patriot in a growing wave of protest. There's been protest all over the world at Russia's brutal act. Resistance, futile though everyone knows it to be, continues. Burning vehicles are pushed into tanks and trucks to set them on fire. Crowds jeer and argue with the blank, uncomprehending faces of the troops they thought were their allies. But defiance is crushed under the tracks of the Russian tanks.
The Soviets claim they have a right to invade under the Brezhnev Doctrine, the right to intervene if any Iron Curtain country moves towards capitalism.
Tempers flare and the Russians start shooting. A nation that has grasped freedom now has it snatched away by naked force.
72 Czechs and Slovaks are killed.
Já mám pocit, že bohužel se to lidi vzali velice rychle. Prakticky do 2 let bylo v široké veřejnosti posekáno takzvaně.
Dubček is ousted and his reforms are reversed. The Prague Spring is over. Czechoslovakia begins a 20-year stretch of hardline Soviet rule. Communist forces seem to be gaining ground on many fronts, but the USA is about to score a major Cold War victory. The space race. So far, it's 3-0 to the USSR, who have managed to put the first satellite, the first animal, and then the first human into space. The USA is striving for the first man on the moon, but the journey has its ups and downs.
And spacemen of tomorrow, together with life science editor Warren Young, get a taste of the world of weightlessness. Each zero-gravity run lasts for only 15 seconds, but those who have experienced it say that in no gravity, time seems to stretch out, and you gradually do learn to navigate.
At impact, the capsule did not right itself as I had expected it to. That I had an hour to wait for recovery. I inflated the raft and climbed in. The raft was upside down, however. I saw 4 or 5 airplanes circling the area. The next thing I heard was a man calling to me from the water behind the raft. I offered them some food, but they had just had lunch and weren't hungry.
The spacesuited commander about to wait in the capsule at the top of the Redstone rocket. As the rocket soared, cameras inside the capsule recorded Shepard's reactions. The rocket reached over 5,000 miles an hour and a height of 115 miles.
The space race had as much, and perhaps even more, to do with missile superiority than placing, people on the moon That's the exploration side of it was exciting, but there is absolutely no question that the massive effort was being put in the development of strategic missiles and the weapon systems on those strategic missiles.
In 4 weeks' time, astronauts Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins will attempt the 3-day journey to the moon.
The journey of the astronauts is more than a technical achievement. It is a reaching out of the human spirit. What could bring home to us more the limitations of the human scale than the hauntingly beautiful picture of our Earth seen from the moon? When the first man stands on the moon, every American will stand taller because of what he has done.
On July 20th, 1969, 2 members of the human race set foot on a rock in outer space.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over. That would be an honor. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth.
I knew a lot of these guys. I grew up with them. I mean, it takes a special kind of person to place oneself in harm's way in that manner. And all of them did it, whether they were cosmonauts or astronauts. Heroes.
And now, the first man to set foot on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
The strategic importance of the United States being the first to put a person on the moon, I truly believe cannot be understated how important that was.
The USA is finally ahead in the race to explore space. It is a landmark in human endeavor. It is also a foothold into the future battleground of the Cold War.
The United States has been fighting the Vietnamese people longer than anyone else in its entire history.
September 1969, the United Nations. Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko replies to President Nixon's latest request for peace talks.
We pride ourselves on the fact that the Soviet Union's assistance is multiplying the capabilities of free Vietnam in its arduous and heroic struggle.
The war in Vietnam has been unremitting for 4 years.
The political settlement of the Vietnam problem are presently underway in Paris. To think that the United States can obtain at the conference table what it failed to achieve with a 500,000 strong army on the battlefield would mean to be obviously at variance with reality.
More talks were held in Paris with the North Vietnamese, but the dialogue was hardly meaningful. It appeared as if the only thing each side was prepared to accept was the virtual surrender of the other.
If there was no superpower involved on both sides, perhaps if there is any war, it's only small scale.
Talks are not making any progress, and neither is the war on the ground.
In a similar position to this to the south, we were 2 weeks almost in the same position. Just couldn't go. Maybe took 500 or 600 casualties before we even gained an inch.
We really only have two choices open to us if we want to end this war. I can order an immediate precipitate withdrawal of all Americans from Vietnam without regard to the effects of that action. or we can persist in our search for a just peace.
Hopes for a breakthrough rest with the new president of the USA, Richard Milhous Nixon.
Mr. Prime Minister, our two peoples tonight hold the future of the world in our hands.
Nixon's definition of a just peace requires the North to allow South Vietnam to remain free of communism. He believes there is only one way to get that commitment.
I ordered the bombing of North Vietnam and the mining of Haiphong.
3 bombers dropped 60 tons of high explosive. It arrived simultaneously in an area 1 kilometer wide and 2 kilometers long.
It sounds irrational to me that in a free society, the President of the United States would sit in a room alone and make a decision that might bring on World War III without so much as even consulting the leaders or the members of the Congress of the United States.
It is not the easy way. It is the right way. It is a plan which will end the war and serve the cause of peace, not just in Vietnam, but in the Pacific and in the world.
During the period from December 26th to January 1st, U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps air crews flew more than 650 tactical airstrikes, and the Air Force flew 126 B-52 missions against military targets in North Vietnam.
The North Vietnamese are no longer fighting as guerrillas. The North Vietnamese now are in divisional strength. They're on the highways packed with trucks and personnel carriers. They are a logical target, and there are some 48 targets right now that are not covered by aerial protection that B-52s could wipe out.
But the B-52s are also wiping out non-military targets. Troops taken prisoner are shown the horror of their work.
Since being captured and being a prisoner, I have seen some areas that were bombed that were non-military targets.
Mm-hmm. For example?
A hospital and a school.
The bombings stir up protests worldwide.
That the allegations of atrocities committed in Vietnam are hurting our worldwide reputation. But perhaps what is even more important than our image in the world is the conscience of the American people.
This conscience is powerfully expressed by university students across the nation.
Our intent was to make as clear as we could to the President that the present disturbance on campuses was not a minor issue.
We've issued an official call of the National Supervisory Board of the National Student Association calling for a nationwide student strike.
I think the government was worried about them in the sense that they, I don't know that they felt the politics of them were so threatening, but I think people feared riots and things that would happen. I know a young fellow that worked in the unit that I was assigned to in Washington came around a corner and there was a big riot, and they took him out of his car and turned his car over or burned it, and I remember we all chipped in to buy him a new car.
Now, I understand that there has been and continues to be opposition to the war in Vietnam on the campuses and also in the nation. Under no circumstances will I be affected whatever by it.
It was a crazy time. The country was torn apart by how people felt about Vietnam. I can recall a group of students, probably 500 or 1,000, were going to go trash what was called the Cooley Labs at the University of Michigan. And the Cooley Lab had an atomic reactor in it. You know, you can't have students going in tearing up a lab with a reactor.
Tension across the USA is high. Then, students are killed.
In Ohio 2 years
Kent State University, May the 4th, 1970. The National Guard opens fire on a protest. They fire 67 rounds. 9 students are wounded. 1 is paralyzed for life. 4 of them die.
When you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State.
Jeffrey Miller, age 20. Allison Krauss, age 19. William Schroeder, age 19. And Sandra Shore, age 20. 2 of the students killed were not even involved in the protest.
I saw the pictures of those 4 youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence.
The Kent State University shootings were a real problem with the forces in Vietnam, to the degree that the GIs thought that the American people were against the war, and it was very disheartening to them and led to very low morale and to drug use and to other problems.
The Vietnam War is radicalizing young people.
Too many have died already. Too many from Massachusetts, too many from your states, too many of our young men and too many of theirs. Too many children and too many aged. The time to end the war is now. We must carry that message to every corner of the land.
In the chaos, President Nixon brings down U.S. involvement in the war.
I have decided to reduce the authorized troop ceiling in Vietnam to 484,000 by December 15.
In Vietnam itself, 1970 saw the continuation of the American troop withdrawal and an increasingly important role being assigned to South Vietnam's own army.
Under the newly authorized troop ceiling, a minimum of 60,000 troops will have been withdrawn from Vietnam by December 15.
American military leadership, much of it from here at West Point, has been superb. I am grateful that only a small number of this class has orders for Vietnam.
The mass bombings and international protests continue for 3 more years. There seems to be no end to the madness.
All of the senators, hardly without exception, and I know of no exceptions, have been trying to get information. Why the bombing? Why the massive bombing?
It is an orchestrated lie, orchestrated by the Pentagon to make the American people hate the Vietnamese.
We're here representing a newly formed American anti-war movement organization called the Indochina Peace Campaign, with the immediate focus of putting pressure on the Nixon administration to sign the 9-point peace agreement.
In more than 30 years of sound and fury, more than 3 million dead, wounded or missing. 56,000 dead Americans, 500 Australians, 188,000 South Vietnamese, 900,000 North Vietnamese, 2 million dead and wounded non-combatant civilians.
Finally, in January 1973, peace talks reach a conclusion.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States and Special Advisor Lee Duc-Tho on behalf of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam.
This is the American Forces Vietnam Network.
Well, there it is, what the world has been waiting for, an agreement to end the fighting in Vietnam. The President told us the agreement will be signed on Saturday. American troops to come home within 60 days.
It's overdue, long overdue. People are tired of it. They want to get to their homes. They want to get back to the countries, to the farms. I really do. I think it'll last.
The Vietnamese people themselves are strong people, and I think they will be able to get themselves together. I think that we're doing the right thing by letting them give it a chance.
I'm happy for myself, but most of all, I'm happy for the POWs.
Yeah, right on. That's it.
I'm very happy for the POWs.
Out in 60 days.
Oh, I think there'll be a peace for a while. Whether they stick with it, that's up to those people.
Prophetic words. Within 2 years, the terrible suffering in Vietnam will appear pointless.